Hi, everyone. Automatically works. It's so great. Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be back at the Y, a storied New York institution. I went to school a couple blocks away, so have been in and around it a lot. Special thanks to Seth and his whole team, Heidi in particular, for organizing this. I spend my days talking to people that I don't agree with, so to be part of the Dialogue Project is something really special for me. I want to introduce the leading voices that you're going to be hearing from to have this civil dialogue, not a debate, but really a conversation. First, we have Doriane Coleman. She's a Duke law professor specializing in scholarship on women's sports, children, and the law. She was an elite athlete herself, up to the professional ranks in track, very impressive. Two-time New York State champion in the girls 800, one-time collegiate national champion, and two-time Swiss national champion in the women's 800. She consults to international sports governing bodies on eligibility rules for elite female competition, and is the 2024 to 2025 chair of the World Athletics Working Group on Gender Diverse Athletes. She's the author of a book called On Sex and Gender, A Common Sense Approach. Then we also have Dr. Joanna Harper. She holds a PhD in exercise science from Loughborough University and is currently at the International Center for Olympic Studies at Western University in London, Canada. She's published several studies in peer-reviewed journals focused on the effects of gender-affirming care on the performance of transgender athletes. She also does a lot of advisory work on the international and national level. Sports governing bodies turn to her, including the International Olympic Committee. Her book is called Sporting Gender: The History, Science, and Stories of Transgender and Intersex Athletes. And her interest in transgender athletic performance was actually spurred by her own transition and the speed loss that she encountered as a sub-elite runner, which makes it sound, sub is in there, but it's still a lot faster than I could ever go. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joanna Harper and Doriane Coleman. So just contextually, I think I probably went out of order for how Heidi wanted me to do this, but I wanted you guys to be out here when I talked a little bit about how important not only being part of the Dialogue Project, but talking about this specific topic is. And it's something that I talk about at work all the time. It has salience in the legal community. It has salience in our politics right now. And it certainly is a cultural hotspot. And it's so exciting to be able to talk to people who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to these issues, because I feel like it is too often the loudest voices with the least amount of knowledge about the specifics of it and the real ramifications of these kinds of policies. So I'm beyond thrilled that you guys are here. And again, thank you to the Y for putting me in charge of the next hour of your lives. We're going to start by asking the main question, which is, I obviously haven't memorized, but now I'm nervous. Okay, so should transgender girls and women compete in girls and women's sports? And we're going to start with you, Joanna.
Can people hear me okay? So the first thing that I would like to say is that transgender women are not men who think that they are women. Transgender women are a physiologically distinct subcategory of all women. And the physiological differences between trans women and cis women are important for sport and do need to be considered. However, as a subcategory of all women, I would suggest that transgender women belong in women's spaces unless there is compelling evidence to indicate otherwise. It is certainly true that anyone who goes through a testosterone-fueled puberty, regardless of gender identity, gains very substantial athletic advantages over anyone who doesn't. These advantages include size, strength, speed, stamina, etc. But transgender women who undergo gender-affirming care take testosterone-suppressing drug plus estrogen. And while transgender women don't take these drugs for sport, they take them to be happier, healthier, and less suicidal, but there are very substantial performance changes in the athletic capabilities of trans women after gender-affirming care. And while the science of these athletes is in its infancy, there are currently only 6 published papers looking directly at the performance of transgender athletes. But I would suggest that in looking at the data that exists so far, I would suggest that after gender-affirming care, including testosterone suppression, the athletic capabilities of transgender women are close enough to those of cisgender women that the two groups can compete meaningfully in sport in most events. And maybe to the surprise of everyone, I'm going to quit 40 seconds early.
We're off to a great start then, since everyone's always nervous about time. Doriane, what about you? Should transgender girls and women compete in girls and women's sports?
I think I'm going to go for 2 minutes and 44 seconds. We're big on time, Joanna and I. We like timed things. Is my mic? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Excellent, thank you. So I am for sex-based girls and women's sports. By sex, I mean biological sex, our bodies as male and female. This original design, women and girls competing only against each other, continues to do invaluable work for individuals, their communities, and society. I also support including transgender women and girls in girls and women's sports settings, so long as we understand that it's an accommodation for their gender identity in a sex classification and that inclusion does no harm. I don't think it works to say that we're including transgender women and girls because they're the same or mostly the same, because they're not. We're different in exactly the characteristic that defines and justifies the classification, our sex. I am suggesting that this difference doesn't have to be the end of the inquiry. In settings where it's easy to fit a trans athlete in, this is consistent with our tradition of accommodating people when we can. Here, I think about school sports programs where there are no cuts and that don't feature competition, like my junior high school cross-country program or after-school swimming. These are easy fits. Sometimes it's not easy, though, and sometimes inclusion causes harm. Harm is a pretty malleable word and can lead to a pretty arbitrary rule, but it doesn't have to be this way. If it's pegged to the reasons we have separate sex sports, these should be our guideposts. We have separate sex sports when playing with boys and men discourages women and girls from participating. We have separate sex sports when the performance gap between males and females is such that it diminishes opportunities for women and girls. We have separate sex sports when ignoring sex deprives programs of the value that flows from showcasing the best women and girls the way we showcase the best boys and men. The reason there's such a strong reaction when a transgender girl wins a girls' state championship is that it ticks all 3 boxes. Like competing against doped females, it's discouraging. It eliminates really valuable opportunities. And it leaves us with the opposite of what we set out to showcase. When a male-bodied kid wins a girls' state championship, it represents, for all of our children, female disempowerment. When inclusion is category defeating like this, I return to protecting the original design, women and girls competing only against each other. Here, I think it's useful to remember that sports in general is for everyone, but that's never meant that we get to play or compete wherever we want to. When we don't meet the criteria in one category, and this happens all the time, there's always another. It may not be our number one choice, but it's sports, and it's really all that we have to expect.
Great. Joanna, do you have any thoughts?
The first thing I would say is when Doriane says when a male-bodied, which is how she would refer to a trans woman, wins something, then it is problematic. And what I would say, that because trans women are a subcategory of all women, I don't think that trans women winning something is a problem. I think that if trans women win disproportionately, then it is problematic. And that simply does not occur. As an example, more than 200,000 women compete every year in NCAA sports. In December of 2024, the NCAA president said there were fewer than 10 trans women competing. And that trans people make up approximately 1% of humanity. So this means that trans women were substantially underrepresented in NCAA sports and anywhere else that trans women have been allowed to compete. So I would suggest that, that rather than defeat the category, I would suggest that the inclusion of trans women in the category, while it does expand the category, I think that it actually enhances the category. And obviously, Doriane will disagree with that, but that's her prerogative.
And why we're here. So, Doriane.
I disagree with Joanna mainly about what girls and women's sports are about. As I said at the top of my remarks, the original design, women and girls competing only against each other, does invaluable work, and her recharacterization or her characterization of trans women as women is, of course, a locus of quite some societal debate. I don't think that that debate necessarily has a place in competitive sports, because competitive sports is designed, or the female category in competitive sports is really a sex-based category, and it's designed to be a space for female athletes to compete against each other. And I don't think that at the level of competition where it's where medals, where money, where scholarships, where positions in postseason play, situations of scarce resources that are valuable, and exactly why we separated males and females in sports and have girls and women's sports, that it makes sense to open the category, because it does defeat the goals in the senses that I described. It's discouraging, it's opportunity eliminating, and it has us celebrating the opposite of what we set out to celebrate by creating the category in the first place.
Because this is a conversation, obviously feel free to jump in whenever you see fit, but I wanted to go back to your definition of meaningful competition, because, the way that this was framed in the little blurb, we talk about fair play, and that's the word that typically is passed around when people are talking about this issue. Can you unpack meaningful competition for us a little bit more? And then I think that's a great kind of jumping off pad for us.
Sure. It's not originally my idea. It's from a book called...
Take credit. We're here. Yeah.
It's from a book called Good Sport, and it suggests that biological differences between people are acceptable in sports and indeed often celebrated. But when those biological differences overwhelm the things that we seek, talent, training, determination, those are things we try to determine with sports competition. And if the biological differences between two competitors or two groups of competitors are so large that they overwhelm the things that we are seeking, then people belong in different categories. If the biological differences are small enough, then these are just competition advantages, and those advantages exist all the time. An example that I use very frequently is that left-handed baseball players have many advantages over right-handed baseball players. 40% of Major League Baseball players are lefties, 10% of the population is lefties. And so that is something that's celebrated in the sport of baseball. How many times you hear the righty-lefty thing when you're watching baseball? And it is accepted that left-handed players have advantages. And so that's the idea of meaningful sport. A competitive advantage, a category advantage would be such that a large boxer should not be fighting a small boxer, because no matter how hard the small boxer trains or fights or how good they are, they can't overcome the size difference. But I would suggest that after hormone therapy, the differences between trans women and cis women are small enough that these could be classified as competitive rather than category advantages, and this is the definition of meaningful competition.
The problem with the meaningful competition approach as applied in this context is that it doesn't represent the way most people think about what makes a competition meaningful. We spent quite a long time on this issue in the World Athletics Review that we just did in the last couple of years. And one of the things that, that became clear through that review is that, this is hard. One of the things that became clear in that review is that we don't think it's meaningful, or female athletes don't think it's meaningful to compete against a person who has category advantages. And I understand, Joanna, that your argument seeks to eliminate the category advantage or to describe it away. But in fact, the way we think about it is not that it's meaningful that you do good battle down the runway with somebody, or that your performance, your time is close to that person so that they're not dominating you. It's that you're competing against somebody who's similarly situated with respect to the characteristic that defines the category. When Katie Ledecky, for example, dominates her competition, right? And we don't think of competition as not being meaningful when she's in it. We celebrate how phenomenal she is as an athlete. We don't think the same way about, for example, Leah Thomas winning nationals or even coming second in nationals. And the reason we don't feel the same way about it is not because we're transphobic, it's because we see it as a category error, and precisely a category error in the wrong direction. If it was in boxing, we would describe that as punching down. And I understand, again, Joanna, and appreciate very much that, that your point is that, or your argument is that it's not punching down because the times are close, for example, if it's running or swimming, but it's not viewed that way because the two competitors, if you were going to put a female athlete and a trans athlete against each other, the two competitors are not similarly situated with respect to the classification design, which is being a female athlete.
So one thing that comes up, and you've both mentioned kind of age, or we're looking for where we could agree, and you mentioned intramural sports, right, where no cuts, everybody's playing. And then where things tend to get dicier is when people go through puberty. And girls are going through puberty a couple years earlier than boys are. And that's even earlier than it used to be, which is kind of astounding to me based on even from when I went through puberty, that now girls, 8, 9 years old, are getting their first periods. How can we address the puberty question, I guess, in dealing with these younger kids who might not be ready for gender-affirming care, right? Might just be identifying, they know that they're transgender, but they haven't been through a course of hormones to bring down their testosterone levels, to make it meaningful or fair, any definition of that. So, can you talk a bit about the puberty question and how that affects this conversation?
So I would defer to Joanna initially on the question of female gender affirming care, so a transgender girl, for example, and the timing and all of that. I mean, I know what it is, but of course Joanna knows it better. I would just say that that one of the things that's been really hard about working on this issue over the last 10 years or more it's about 10 years now for me, and I know Joanna's been working on it for quite a lot longer, is that, that the focus of the conversation and the focus of the work has really been on the transgender girl and on the male body and its sexual development and the point at which the male body reaches 10 or 2, where the child would go on gender-affirming hormones or go on puberty blockers and then gender-affirming hormones. And throughout that process, including in the litigation, there's the focus on that transgender girl and what is, does she retain advantages? Have the advantages been blocked, et cetera, et cetera? And then the decision is made by a lot of people, policymakers and otherwise, that, oh, there's enough done there. There's enough work done there. The blockers have worked, or the gender-affirming care has worked, and it's worked without, or the analysis is done focused on that person, focused on that child, right, or that individual, and no one's looking over here at the female child and what she's going through, right? And so you're talking about a 12, 13, 14-year-old transgender girl, and you're talking about the advantages that she has or doesn't have. And you're not relating them to what's going on with the female child and her sexual development, and when she's going through puberty and the fact that she may be in the throes of her first menstrual cycle, and that should be the basis for that should be part of the discussion about what's going on in the arena between those two athletes, and whether competition is fair, taking her development into account as well, taking what she's going through into account as well. And so I'll leave to Joe the discussion or the description of the transgender girl. I just want to note that it's just been startling to me to watch that discussion and to watch the litigation and to watch the debates, and it's entirely focused over there, but it should be also focused here. I'm not saying it should only be focused on the female athlete, but that the conversation should join the two, and that the two should be part of the discussion.
Just to be clear to the audience, Tanner 2 refers to the beginning of puberty, and so there are 5 stages, and Tanner stage 1 is pre-puberty, and Tanner 2 is the beginning of puberty, and Doriane referred to that. Look, I would say that when we're talking about young kids, when we talk about them as athletes, generally speaking, what we mean are kids playing sports. And I think we should let all kids play sports. If we don't make accommodation for trans kids don't play sports. The uniforms are very gender specific. The boundaries are such that trans kids don't fit, and they just don't play sports. 1/6 as often do trans kids go out for sports. And sports are so valuable for everyone. And at that stage, if trans kids don't get to play sports, then they don't get all of the benefits of sports that Doriane and I both enjoyed, and so many other kids. And so I would think that if we put too much focus on what does or doesn't happen to young trans kids, then we just shut them out of such a very important part of life, and it's a tragedy.
Do you want to reflect on that? And I would love for you to dip in. You mentioned the legal ramifications of this, and there are a couple of cases that are going to be heard at the Supreme Court. I guess they're combined, and the Idaho one might not go through, but either way, the crux of them is about transgender girls who have both been on the requisite puberty blockers and gender-affirming care from the outset, who are now not being allowed to compete at 15 years old. I think in the West Virginia case, that's how old she is now.
So I agree 100% with Joanna that all kids belong in school sports, and all kids should have the opportunity to play sports. That's not the question, right? The question is where they play. That's the debate. I think that a school district or a league that doesn't, or school district, let's leave it at school districts, school district that doesn't set up their after-school sports program or their in-school sports program in a way that is accommodating or welcoming to all kids, whatever their issues are, right? It doesn't have to be that they're transgender. It could be that they're disabled in some way. It could be that they are shy about participating in sports. Smart sports policymakers figure out how to open up opportunities for kids to play. And with respect to sex-based sports, that could be that there are some opportunities for kids to play that are absolutely open. Like, I don't know about your. You played basketball in high school, right? Did you run cross country?
I did.
Yeah. So my cross country, like our I mentioned it before, like our after school cross country program was definitely co-ed, and that at some point, some people went off to some like local meet or whatever, but it was mainly a unisex opportunity. The point is that all kids should play. We agree on that. We disagree to the extent that we disagree about whether trans girls compete in competitive, exclusive girls and women's sports, or girls' sports, if we're talking about that here. The litigation in the United States Supreme Court this term includes two cases. One is a case out of West Virginia, and the trans girl in that case is a girl who's, I think she's 15 or 16 now, and she went on puberty blockers at 10 or 2 at the onset of her puberty, and then straight to gender affirming care. So she's not experienced male puberty, and the plaintiff, or the woman in the Idaho case, Hecox, transitioned as an older adolescent, young adult. And so the court has essentially, the two of the paradigm cases of a transgender female who want to participate in competitive exclusive opportunities, and they're both cases under Title IX and also the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the court rules on this, though. I have a guess as to how it is going to go, and that relates directly as well, I think, to the current political environment, which I want to get into as well. I did not have any expectation that transgender athletics was going to be such a prominent issue, like in the 2024 election. And, it's featuring, we have big...
You really didn't?
No, that's wrong. I didn't think that it would permeate the conversation, that it would transfer over, I guess, to left-leaning voters as prominently as it did, I guess I should say. Donald Trump's obviously been talking about it for a long time, but he kind of struck gold, I would say, with Leah Thomas versus Riley Gaines, and then that Charlemagne the God ad, where the they-them ad, which was actually about economic opportunity, but this is not a politics chat in that sense. But they're talking about it as well in the Virginia gubernatorial race, and Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, has said that she thinks it should be left up to, it's a case-by-case basis.
Schools and parents.
Schools and, yes. So do you think that is the right answer to the question of what you do about transgender girls in girls' sports up through the high school level?
So I'm a Democrat, and I've been frustrated at our politicians for years now. And mainly I've been frustrated that they won't talk about this. They won't wrestle with it in the nuanced and complicated way it deserves. I'm glad that some Democratic politicians are now starting to at least say something about it. I don't think that's the right thing to say, because practically, if you know anything about school sports, that's not a solution, right? If a parent decides that their child isn't allowed to compete or must compete, it still has to. It confronts the system, right? And the competitive system, isn't a solo system. It's the school district, it's the county, it's the league, it's the state, and what other children are allowed to do or not allowed to do. And similarly with the school, if a school decides that a transgender girl can compete or can't compete, does that mean that other schools have to let her run or can't let her run? So it has to be, I think, in all honesty, I think it's a canned line that's supposed to get her by that issue, and not really useful in the sense of solving or even pretending to solve the problem.
And I actually agree with Doriane on this. So I absolutely think that there needs to be some decisions made at state level, federal level. I would think I would make different decisions than Doriane would if I were queen of sports, but I don't think you can just leave it up to parents or the individual schools, or you just have so much difference across schools and districts, and it just wouldn't work.
She's definitely just trying to get by and get through the next couple of weeks. And it was interesting, there was new polling that came out today that this issue is only the top concern for 3% of voters who are going to turn out, but it is the number one thing that her opponent is talking about, obviously, because of this kind of salience. And I want to go to kind of the 80-20 of it all. So this is, based on recent polling. There was a New York Times poll, 79% of Americans agree, including 65% plus of Democrats, that the answer to this question, that transgender girls and women should not be in girls and women's sports. And I guess I'll start with you, Joanna. I don't want to put you on the spot, like, how does that make you feel? But what do you think is the best way to communicate your position when you're up against such an enormous hill to climb?
It certainly is a hill to climb, but quite frankly, I think that a poll taken 50 years from now will have a much different result. And I, as I say, I think that trans girls belong in women's spaces in general. And, this topic has been used as a wedge issue to get, to hurt trans people in general. And because what has happened after sports has been gender-affirming care of trans in the military, so on and so forth. And so what I would say is it comes down to this very fundamental question of what do we think of transgender people? And I would say trans people are who we say we are. I am a woman because I say I'm a woman. I believe I'm a woman. I have since as early as any other woman, I knew I was a girl. And that is my soul, my being. I am a woman. And physiologically different than other women, I agree. And so I think that the physiological differences need to be considered, but I think that we have to start treating trans people as being who they say they are.
Doriane, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, so I think I've already responded to Joanna's point to the extent that I think that all that can be right, and there are still places, including especially the female category in competitive sports, right, in exclusive competitive sports, where the physiological difference in being female is something that is also real, and also, I say also, right, also real and also matters in a way that, that goes far to explaining the 80-20 split. I agree with you, Joanna. I think it would be really hard not to, that this issue has been used by the GOP as a wedge issue, and that some people in the GOP just want to win elections, and they don't think one way or the other about the actual substance of the issues. They don't care about sports. They don't necessarily care about female athletes or even transgender women and girls and female athletes. They're using it to win elections, and or they're transphobic. I mean, it could be a combination of all of that. But it is wrong, and the numbers show that it's wrong, to describe or to ascribe the mood on this issue or the views on this issue as being all sort of right-wing, conservative, GOP politicking, right? The reason it's a wedge issue, the reason it's a successful political tool is because 80% of people think that that there is value in an exclusive female category, right, or a classification for exclusive competition, and I think to pretend otherwise, and I do think that Democratic politicians, this explains in part the silence or the reticence to talk about it. I think that they understand that, right? But for whatever reason, they won't address it in the way that would be effective. I disagree with you about 50 years from now. Who knows, right?
Neither of us will be alive
Yeah, no,
then.
probably not. I disagree with you. One of the most interesting things that I've learned recently, or that I relearned recently, or put together recently, is that the numbers have actually, when you poll female athletes, right, the numbers have been the same for 35, 40 years, right? In 1996, the IOC polled the female athletes that they last tested, sex tested using the SRY gene test, and between 84 and 88% of those athletes were happy to be tested, were happy that it was a sex-based category, and had no problems with genetic testing. And the numbers are pretty similar today when we check on the sense of the female field about whether it is meaningful or fair to compete against, and I will say it again, male-bodied athletes. In girls and women's sports, I mean, and this is really important to understand, right? They're hugely gender diverse, right? Female athletes are very gender diverse. They're not concerned about gender diversity or gender identity. They're not transphobic. They're not genderphobic. They just want to compete against like-bodied people, and they think that that's what's fair. And those numbers have not changed, and they're pretty close to the political numbers. What happens is when people discount them and they think that they're based on ignorance or lack of empathy or all of that, part of it, you end up masking what's really going on, and then you lose the capacity to sort of understand and use that to your advantage. And I think, again, the Democrats have missed sort of an unforced error on this.
Definitely. I mean, you see that even, Gavin Newsom and Seth Moulton have talked about this and then faced a massive amount of backlash kind of from, I guess, what you would say is the activist class on this, not the regular mainstream Democrat. The last thing I wanted to talk to you both about is the temperature of these conversations. So this is the model of civil discourse, right? And I saw them in the green room. They genuinely like each other. And how do you think we can get to a better place in discussing such a fraught, difficult issue where everybody has an opinion and has a very serious opinion on this particular topic?
Well, maybe you put Doriane and I in charge of
Queens of sports?
Yeah, but or at least queens of the discussion. But look, it's true. I have seen quote unquote professional panels where they devolve into name calling, and it's just really painful, regardless of your position, to be in a room where people who are supposed to be expert are standing up on stage and calling each other names, and it's a horrible, horrible thing to go through. And look, it's hard to disagree fundamentally with somebody that you care for as a person, right? And Doriane and I have both faced this. We've known each other since 2017, and we've had lots of conversations on these topics. It's difficult, and I don't think social media helps. there are so many people who just want to score points and on social media and aren't interested in the substantive discussion. And so it is extraordinarily hard to try to put your emotion aside and talk rationally, reasonably, and listen too, not just talk. And so how does that happen? Do we have to have a fundamental change of the species? I'm not sure, right? But this conversation is one of the major things tearing this country apart, and it's horrible.
Yeah, Doriane.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I struggle with is the emotion piece, right? You heard me. I think that people feel really strongly about sex, and they feel really strongly about gender, and that's because it actually matters deeply to all of us. And I think girls and women, transgender girls and women in women's sports, that issue, right, has even if you don't care about girls and women's sports, even if you don't know trans people, even if you don't know anything about the discussion, it's provocative because it goes to, one second, do I get more time? Yeah.
Definitely. Take as much time as you want.
It goes to who we fundamentally are, right? And so what Joanna says about who she is, that's really deep and important for her. And I think so too. It's really deep and important for me that my life, right? Her life is described. She describes her life and her sense of herself in these fora in an incredibly, and she's extraordinary about this, in an incredibly unemotional way. But I know it's obviously emotional. I have a harder time with this than she does, and I don't even pretend half the time. When someone tells me that it doesn't matter, that you're female, that sex doesn't matter, I freeze up, right? Even though I've been studying this and I've been trying to be a scholar about it and hopefully I've done a good job with it. But I think being able to respect the fact that people may think differently and may feel very differently, but it is essential to who they are, right? And if you can come to the table understanding that and respecting that, I think that helps. I mean, even if people get emotional, right? It helps to see that and to say, I see that you're sincere. I see that you care a lot about this. Will you hear me out? Will you listen? And you may not change anybody's mind, right? And likely you won't change anybody's mind on issues so profound as this. But you'll hear them, and you'll feel their humanity, and I think that can contribute to bridging. I mean, conversations like this can contribute to bridging at least small divides and interpersonal divides in a way that may build into something more important over time.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with both your positions. We want to do a couple audience questions. The first one, much of the debate centers on testosterone. Could you outline what the current scientific consensus is regarding the permanence of athletic advantages, muscle mass, lung capacity, after a transgender woman has undergone hormone therapy for, say, 2 or 3 years?
So first of all, there are only 6 published papers looking at trans athletes. There are a lot of other papers that talk about this issue, but there is a paucity of data. But I would say that the changes that occur would fall into 3 categories. First of all, there are some changes with hormone therapy that are complete. Within 3 to 4 months of starting hormone therapy, trans women will acquire female typical hemoglobin values, and that hemoglobin is an important component of endurance performance. And that is because hemoglobin cells in our body only live 120 days, and we produce hemoglobin at a rate that's proportional to testosterone. So we cut down the testosterone, the hemoglobin follows. Second category is partial changes. Trans women will lose strength with hormone therapy. That strength loss is not complete. Trans women, even after an extended period of hormone therapy, will be physically stronger than cisgender women. How much stronger is a very substantial debate, but certainly stronger. However, there are papers that have been published over the past few years that suggest that when we look at it in a pound-for-pound way or relative to body size, trans women and cis women have equal strength. And that's not true of men and women. Even pound for pound, men are substantially stronger. And that affects sports like running and jumping, anything where you're moving your body using your strength. It wouldn't be so much of an matter so much in sports like throwing, where absolute strength is more important. And in most team sports, it's a combination of absolute and relative strength that's important. And of course, skill and all those other things. And then lastly, there are things that don't change with hormone therapy, like height. Trans women don't lose height with hormone therapy. And there are many sports where height is advantageous. There are some sports like gymnastics where it's disadvantageous. But that's sort of the lay of the land in terms of what happens, in terms of exactly the numbers and so on. There's a lot of disagreement yet, and with the paucity of data, that's understandable.
So I would just add, I mean, obviously Joanna's the scientist here, so I'm not going to pretend that that I've done the work that she's done, but I can say that the reason that World Athletics reached the decision this past year to stop including transgender women in elite sport at global level, in elite athletics, meaning the sport of track and field, right, at elite level, is because it is clear, including from Joanna's work, that overall advantage is retained, and that percentage of overall advantage is quite significant. So for just ballparking it, and Joanna can curate the ballpark numbers I'm using, but in events that feature strength and power, so sprints, throws, those kinds of things, you're at a retained advantage of over 90%. And then in the middle to long distances, between 40 and 60% are the numbers that we're seeing. And whatever the numbers are, and again, Joanna may have more detailed numbers, but whatever the numbers are, the overall advantage is quite substantial that's retained. Minimal advantage overall is lost. Overall advantage, right? And that's including all of the parameters that Joanna broke down just now. And that, in combination with the fact that civil and human rights advocates are against T suppression requirements, so against testosterone suppression requirements, are describing it as unethical at best. Together, the scientific information, together with the adversarial position the civil and human rights organizations are taking, and the commitment to protecting the female category, together yielded the result that we reached in the World Athletics process.
So I would fundamentally disagree with those numbers, and I wasn't involved with the study that came up with those numbers. And the people who came up with those numbers have not done any testing on trans athletes. I would say that the strength advantages in an absolute sense are about 30% for trans women, 20%, something like that. And as I say, in relative strength, I would suggest there's no advantage. And that matters in sprinting and jumping. One of the tests that we have done on trans athletes is called a counter movement jump, which is similar to a vertical jump. And there are now 8 studies, not a lot, but still 8 studies looking at it. Trans women don't jump higher. And that is because they don't have a relative strength advantage. And so that, in the jumping events, if trans women don't jump higher, they don't jump farther. And so, yes, I fundamentally disagree, although I acknowledge that the data are young at this point. But I very fundamentally disagree with the numbers Doriane presented.
And we did that so nicely. We have time probably for one more. I'll start with you on this, Doriane. Are there ways to structure competition like open divisions or skill-based groupings that could address fairness concerns while keeping sports inclusive? And then by extension, because I think it's linked, that would lend itself maybe to an argument of there potentially being separate categories for trans athletes, and what you think about that.
Again, Joanna will speak to this as well. I don't think that that's viable in the elite sports space or in most domestic contexts, mainly because the trans advocates are categorically against open classifications or separate classifications at all. So the position that Joanna is arguing for here for inclusion in the female category is the position, and it's, you know, they're holding fast. And so any efforts that that we've made at the regulatory level to try to open up conversation about that has gone absolutely nowhere. I was involved also in the World Aquatics process in 2021, 22, and you know, we tried to develop an open category, and it was immediately rejected, and nobody came. And so what you have to do is be responsive, right, to the arguments and to the constituencies that you're dealing with, and that's just not going anywhere right now.
Joanna?
So I would agree with Doriane that at elite levels of sport, there has to be a female category, and there have to be very considerate eligibility requirements. It doesn't mean banning trans women, I think, but that has to be well thought out. I would say at lower levels of sport, yes, absolutely. And, you know, there are sports like ultimate frisbee that are inherently co-ed, and there are a number of things that can be done at grassroots levels to provide, you know, to provide competition in ways that are other than simply male-female. And a third category can work. The New York City Marathon next week has a non-binary category. I don't know, whether there are 40,000 people, there will probably be fewer than 100 in the non-binary category, but there's a category there, and people will participate in that category. So these things can work, but at elite levels, I do agree that there needs to be a female category.
Okay, great. Last thing then, can you make a distinction between girls like in elementary school and fully developed women?
In what way? What do you mean?
That's all that she wrote, or that he wrote.
Yes, you can distinguish between those groups.
Yeah, no, I guess. Yeah.
In terms of the rules?
Yes,
Yeah.
I am assuming yes, because
Yeah,
we can
I
all
mean,
spot the difference.
No, I think that, you know, I think it's kind of obvious that if at younger ages, sport, to the extent that it's organized, is less likely to be competitive and exclusive. And so in those contexts, obviously, it's easier also, this is all seemingly obvious, but it's easier to imagine, there are already lots of co-ed settings or unisex settings. It's easy to imagine, as I said in my opening remarks, even if it's a sex-based space, to fit a trans girl in. It's just as sports gets more competitive and exclusive, and it is getting more competitive and exclusive at younger ages, right? But like elementary school kids are still mostly, especially at school, mostly playing in non-competitive, non-exclusive situations, and so that should be an easy fit, or can be an easy fit. I want to respect people who think it's not, but it can be an easy fit.
I'm okay with that.
Fantastic, and it's perfect timing. So I want to ask everyone to take out their phones, and you're going to vote again using that QR code on the fundamental question of the debate.
Can I just suggest that the question is the wrong question? It's forced
Yeah.
into merging girls and women into the same category without allowing, for example, the last comments, that for girls in elementary school, it is easier to accommodate transgender women than as you move up and women move into become fully developed women, and especially as you get into progressively more competitive situations where a person's future performance can make a big difference. Doriane got into, as a recipient of Title IX. Doesn't the blurring of the elimination of gender differences risk eviscerating Title IX, and then risk people who are highly competitive in sports, like Doriane, if she's competing against somebody who has even a marginal difference? I mean, I respect the point that Dr. Harper's making, that the differences are minimum. But my understanding is that in sports like swimming and running and track, and we're talking about hundredths of a second, which can determine whether somebody advances to the Olympics or not. And their whole career, after putting in, working, very hard from an early age to junior high, high school, that those differences, back to your point about what is meaningful competition, those are meaningful differences.
We agree, and we knew that the question was tough. It was very hard to figure out a way to ask a simple question that you could then put on a QR code and vote about. Was saying, like, are you cool with 0 to 5-year-olds playing together versus 5 to 8-year-olds? And then, especially with onset of the puberty process, it gets very murky. And as Doriane just mentioned, kids are competing at a high level in sports earlier and earlier. You go off to AIU basketball tournaments, sometimes starting at an 8 years old. So that's why the question is that way. But we knew that it was boxing you in a little bit. So I apologize about that, but it was a great question and point. So vote, please, and then we'll get the results up here. But do you guys have any final thoughts?
Yeah, vote for me.
Vote for her. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
All right. Well, they voted for you a little bit, Joanna. So should transgender girls and women compete in girls and women's sports? Before, 41% said yes, 59% said no. And then after, you got a little bump there, a 3% bump up for your position, Joanna. So well done, but mostly well done to the conversation. Does this surprise you guys? How do you?
Well, I mean, it's not 80-20, so that's encouraging.
No, it's not 80-20. Actually, that does surprise me that it didn't start off with a bigger differential.
I wouldn't have expected 80-20 with your audience, right?
Fair.
No, but I mean,
Yeah,
seriously,
no.
right?
I was making a joke.
Oh, you were? Yeah. No, but I mean, I think, I don't travel quite as much as Joanna to speak on this issue, but I do a bit, and it really depends on the geography and the audience, right? And if it's a sports audience, if it's an older audience, if it's a younger audience, depending on what part of the country we're in, it's going to be different. I think the 80-20 is really the whole, right? Yeah.
Democratic Party's 65 to 70%.
Right.
So
Right.
it's lower than I expected for that. Sure.
There was no distinction, there is no distinction being made about amongst women and girls how vast the differences can be within that category. I mean, you can, get women who are girls and their testosterone levels are high and they're like Amazons and things like that, and yet that's okay, as opposed to somebody who never went through puberty, who doesn't have anywhere near that kind of body structure.
So actually, among scientists refer to the normal distribution, which refers to the 95% confidence interval, and female testosterone levels are actually in a very narrow range. There is a condition, for instance, called PCOS, or polycystic ovary syndrome, where where there can be a marginal increase, but this idea that successful female athletes have a lot more natural testosterone than others, that doesn't occur unless there are some very rare exceptions. And so, Yeah, body type, yes, but the idea that successful female athletes have so much more testosterone than, no, that just doesn't hold true. And it is a fundamental difference. And you know, the effects of testosterone actually really have to be respected.
I would just say that the variations among female athletes or among females are real and important. It's part of why, if you had an all-female field, for example, you would see exceptional athletes performing really well and outperforming their peers, right? Because there are these variations. But especially, you know, starting at around 14, 15 years old, the girls can't beat the boys. And so that's why we have separate sex sport, is so that girls have the same opportunities as boys to appreciate the value that flows from competitive sports. In just one of the examples that Joanna knows well is that all of and both of us come out of track and field, right? And basketball. Sorry, both of you guys are basketball players, actually. But all of the sort of stars that you know from Paris, like Sha'Carri Richardson and Gabby Thomas and Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone, they wouldn't even made the qualifying standards for the men's team, right? And so the reason we have separate sex sport is that even though there's variation among athletes within the female population, just like there's variation among athletes within the male population, and even though there's overlap in younger age groups and in relatively non-competitive athletes, in competitive athletes, there's no overlap.
All right. We've got to leave it there. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to Doriane and Joanna.